Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Babiš, and I work as the Deputy Head of Foreign Desk in Slovak Daily Pravda, which, by the way, means truth, and it's not Russian Pravda. Who is Andrej Babiš? Who is the real Babiš? The best kind of handle we can get on this is what he said early on about how he wants to run the country like a firm. Clearly, he wants centralized power. He doesn't like checks and balances. That's how Sean Hanley, Associate Professor in Comparative Central and East European Politics at University College London, put it in our conversation. The elections in Czechia will be held on October 3rd and 4th, and Babiš's ANO will probably get over 30% of the votes. Will the populist billionaire of Slovak origin become Prime Minister again? And will he, by cooperating with small radical parties, steer Czechia onto a path similar to Slovakia's? Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. For the link, see also a description of this episode. And now, up to the new debate. Sean, in the run-up to elections, Czech center-right and liberal parties are warning that the victory for Andrej Babiš's ANO could push country onto a Slovak political path and towards pro-Russian positions. How effective is this narrative? Does it actually resonate with Czech voters?
It's much less effective than it was in 2021 when Babiš was in government and the Together coalition, led by Fiala and ODS, were in opposition and were kind of something new. So I think it cuts through to some of their supporters, and in the run-up to the election, it may resonate a bit more. But on the whole, economic issues have dominated. This kind of democracy is on the line message is less effective. And obviously there's a very powerful anti-incumbent dynamic, and so there's more of an anti-Fiala mood than an anti-Babiš mood. So it's been much less effective, I think, this time round. Not completely ineffective, but it doesn't seem to be delivering.
So when Interim Minister Mr. Vít Rakušan participated at the protest in Bratislava, of course he said that as a normal citizen here, it probably would give him much of the boost.
I don't think it is. I mean, especially with, obviously, one of the leaders of the Mayors and Independents. And the Mayors and Independents have done an interesting thing in distancing themselves from the government in which they're a junior partner, and initially trying to project themselves as a sort of sensible middle alternative between the kind of austerity and hard right-wing politics of Spolu and the populism of ANO. This doesn't seem to have worked. Showing up in Bratislava and sort of trying to align things in terms of liberalism versus populism, democracy versus authoritarianism, which is much more of a kind of dynamic, it's much more of a mobilizing factor in Slovak politics right now. That seems to be a kind of slightly odd move. As you say, he's kind of sitting on two horses, he's there, but he's not there. So, I mean, I don't think that's going to be effective. And I think the Mayors and Independents, they were forecast to be the dark horse of this election. They're a party who are broadly acceptable to a lot of voters. And I think they were taken in by this, or rather their advisors, their political advisors, the politicals who are Slovak, in fact, Slovak political consultants who are advising them, have crafted a strategy which initially sought to project them as a potential leading party of government with this kind of sensible middle politics. That's failed, leaving the mayors sort of stuck on 11%. They've sort of repeated the mistake that the Pirates made, or the Pirates suffered from last time, being a relatively small, middle-sized party kind of thinking too big. And that message isn't credible. And Rakušan doing in Bratislava, as I said, doing neither one thing nor the other. He's not standing up there saying, we too face this threat. He's there, but at the same time, he's standing aside. So it's rather awkward. It's not sending a clear political message. Mayors and Independents particularly, I think, have had a confused and ineffective campaign.
If the argument that Czechia under Babiš would resemble Slovakia under Fico is not proving particularly persuasive, what issues are most decisive for voters?
I think for many voters and for the voters who matter, what you could loosely call a kind of Czech middle class, but in the kind of American sense of a broad group of people who are kind of neither very prosperous nor very poor. It's the economy. It's things like the price of food, the quality of public services, the price of energy. This is the issue, certainly the issue for the voters who matter. And obviously Babiš and his campaign, which is very, very attuned to public opinion, has homed in on this and focused on this entirely. The kind of culture wars rhetoric has been largely dropped. Viktor Orban is not being invited to appear on the campaign trail this time, although I believe Babiš and Orban are going to make a public appearance after the election in Budapest, and that's what I've been given to understand. So it is the economy. So, I mean, Czech politics has sort of gone back to what it always was, which was a politics centering around who gets what, when, where, and how, centering on economic issues.
So, even though this argument about the Slovak political past is not working that well, do you think that Czechia might be on this political part that might resemble Slovakia?
Well, I mean, the thing is, Slovakia, and I guess it's the same in reverse, Slovakia is a kind of mirror that Czechs look into and in which they see their hopes and fears. So you can go back across Czech politics for 20 years and Slovakia is always appearing as this negative or positive model that we Czechs don't want to follow. So way back in the day, Miloš Zeman and Václav Klaus were compared to Mečiar, and so we have a country with two Mečiars. Then Slovakia was talked up as a model of free market reform at a certain point, and now obviously some people are looking across at Fico and thinking, will we go there? I think you can exaggerate the similarities between what will happen and what won't happen. There are similarities in the sense that they're what you could call the kind of populist anti-liberal camp has emerged both in Czechia and Slovakia, not through the right, but from somewhere else, which the Slovak case is through the left, and in the Czech case is through this very kind of strange and unusual Ano movement. But I think the dynamics are different. I think that, I wouldn't want to overstress the role of ideology, but I think Slovak politics is a bit more, and Fico is a bit more kind of ideological and has become more ideological than Babiš, who is just, he has some beliefs, but I think he's completely, really brutally pragmatic and transactional. I think the sort of, lessons that have been learned by people in the, I don't know what to call it, let's call it the left in Slovakia, for want of a better term, they have been different. Slovakia has had the whole, guerrilla affair and after. If this exists in Czechia, which it might, it hasn't really emerged to the same degree. Fico has decided that he needs to take a much firmer hand on institutions and is trying to do so. Babiš, I think, although he has had legal troubles, does not have that sort of mentality. Plus, if you want to remake the Czech political system, you face kind of higher obstacles to do so. The Czech Republic has a Senate, Slovakia doesn't. It's very difficult to change the Czech political system. So there are similarities, but there are the differences, and I would lean towards stressing the differences. Let's assume that Babiš gets back into office. I wouldn't expect a kind of very determined and aggressive attempt to control institutions that we've seen in Slovakia.
So let's talk a bit more about Babiš. It seems fair to say that Babiš is not pro-Russian, but he also does not seem particularly pro-Ukrainian. In addition, he still faces a court verdict in the Stork's Nest case. And in my opinion, he's politically at least a bit more radical than when he entered politics more than 10 years ago. He's closer to Viktor Orban, and he has joined the far-right patriots, although even that could be described as a pragmatic move, since at the European level he didn't have much choice. So if Babiš becomes prime minister, and he has more or less free reign from coalition partners, because it seems he will need some, what is the most radical political steps you would expect from him? For example, will he try to bring public service media under his control?
Okay, so let's just go back to the beginning of your question. The beginning of your question is really, who is Andrej Babiš? Who is the real Babiš? Because he's such a political shapeshifter. We don't know. the best kind of handle we can get on this is what he kind of says early on about how he wants to run the country like a firm. Clearly, he wants to centralize power. He doesn't like checks and balances. And you can see this in remarks. He stopped talking about reforming the political system as he did in 2017. So there's a proposal for referenda, but it's all very vague. But the consistent thread is that he wants to centralize power, and he has a sort of managerial, technocratic view of politics, centering on kind of decisive one-man leadership. And those are his models. What he admires and likes about Orban, I think, is Orban's centralization of power. And what he likes about Trump is Trump's, as he thinks, is Trump's ability to do things decisively. Everything else, I think, is political calculation. Joining Patriots for Europe, yes, no, it's an important signal. And Babiš, like Fico, will appear rather in Congress at CPAC. And I wouldn't say don't take this seriously, but I would say don't be taken in by it. I don't think Czech politics is ideological. I don't think that Babiš is really ideological in the sense of having bought into these kind of national conservative ideas. There's no Czech equivalent to Project 2025. There's no kind of interground of think tanks and institutes and intellectuals providing the kind of backing in terms of ideas that you'd see in Hungary or Poland. There's no big thinking about foreign policy. So it would be limited. Now, what bad things could Babiš do? I don't think his power is going to be untrammeled, much to his disappointment. He has to deal with these small radical parties, and he has to reach a deal with them, or he has to do a slightly more secret, hidden deal with the current parties of the current coalition on certain issues. The institutions that are vulnerable in Czechia, yes, are, the state broadcaster, public media. They're a kind of obvious target because the management can be changed through ordinary legislation and through appointment. I think we could see some pressure on the judicial system. I don't think the Stork's Nest case is really a big threat to Babiš and a big issue. Most voters have factored it in. He'll regain parliamentary immunity. If he's found guilty, which, given the direction of the higher court, he probably would be, by Central European standards, it's a very small case. It's a few million euros. It's a long time ago. He's going to get a fine. He's not facing a kind of jail sentence, and he knows it. So I think he's probably very relaxed about that. But I think one would see probably pressure on institutions. The other thing I can imagine is that if he does do a deal with the radical elements, that he may be inclined to reward them with certain institutions that he doesn't really care about. So culture, education, things like that. And I think if any of these, museums, cultural policy, education policy, or aspects of it are in the hands of some of the kind of radical elements from Stachila or Okamora's party, or some of the people that these parties might nominate if there is a formal coalition, then you could see damaged in certain areas. He might give them certain sort of toys to play with, while ANO keeps firm control of, the economy, the police, justice, foreign affairs, all of the policy areas that really matter for power.
I'm sorry. So it might be a little bit like in Slovakia.
Yeah, it might be a sort of slow Slovakia. I mean, we would certainly see the erosion of institutions, but I don't think you'd see the instant winding up and refounding of the public broadcaster. I think it would be kind of a creeping. And then, of course, you would see more of the sort of, so-called agrofertization of public administration. But it would be, I would say, much more creeping, with risks in the media and culture probably being the highest.
Sean, you touched upon this a bit. So, I know, of course, much will depend on the election outcome, but what would you identify as Babiš preferred post-election scenario? Which partners would he most like to govern with?
Well, I mean, I think his obvious partners are these smaller populist parties on the far right and I'm going to call them the far left, the Enough Stachila coalition. Conceivably the motorists. I don't think they're going to get in, but poll ratings have been creeping up. The key question, though, is not who he works with, but how he works with them. And if there's a formal coalition or if there isn't a formal coalition. I would suspect that Babiš dreads the prospect of having to go into coalition with any of these smaller parties, of having a formal coalition and giving them ministries. He's irritated by any constraints on his power when he was in coalition with the Social Democrats, who were then a more kind of well-established mainstream party. He found this difficult. He's not going to welcome the prospect of working with small radical parties, each of whom are effectively coalitions of many smaller groups with some very radical and some very eccentric political figures. You look at this kind of blogger, Vidlak, very strange and radical people have got onto the Statulo list. The other thing is that I think, Babiš, although he is kind of riding a wave of discontent, including some radical moods at the sort of fringes of on the edges of public opinion, he does not really want the kind of radical system change that some people. He certainly obviously doesn't want any suggestion the country will hold a referendum about the EU, about NATO. So he would like to keep these parties away from power. So to answer your question, what would he do? I think the most likely scenario we would see is a minority government. I think he might again do political deals, what political scientists call confidence and supply type deals with some of these parties, as he did with the communists in 2018. So they were an external party backing him in parliament, keeping him in power in exchange for certain limited political concessions. So what would these concessions be? And I think there would be concessions on certain policies, or there might be certain kind of appointments. So you could imagine that a certain minister who's notionally independent or an expert might be appointed at the behest of Tomio Okamura or Statulo. And of course, there's simple kind of patronage politics of appointments in state companies and state agencies. From Babiš's point of view, I think a minority government is much more manageable. And of course, he can play a waiting game, waiting for these blocks to disintegrate, waiting for there to be some independent MPs who would be more pliable and more biddable. And he can also create a dynamic where he can sort of do a bit like what the Czech Social Democrats used to do. They can sort of trade off one end of the political spectrum against another. So he could cooperate with the parties of the current coalition on certain issues and cooperate with his allies on the radical right, radical left on others, and sort of balance between them. And I think that's going to be for him a much more attractive and much more workable model than any kind of formal coalition.
You said that Czech politics is less ideological than flower politics, but if we adapt the worlds of freedom and direct democracy of Tomio Okamura, enough Statulo and the motorists, that will be somewhere between 20-25% for radical right and left wing groups that are also Russian. What does it tell us about Czech society and the political scene? Is it something that we should look at? Or is this basically what we see in many other countries?
It's basically what we see in many other countries, but we should look at this. I mean, we should look at what forms these sort of radical moods and these radical ideas will take, not so much in terms of the current election, but looking down the line about the way that Czech politics will develop, particularly given that Anna in the current form is not going to be there forever. Babiš is now, I think, 71. He's not going to be in politics forever. Anna is really a kind of personal party for him. He's controlled by him. Something will happen to it. And I think if you look at the fringes of Czech politics, what you can see is there are people who are working on a much more thought through fusion of radical left and radical right ideas. And you can see this particularly around the Statulo coalition. I mean, Czech communists have evolved they always were quite nationalistic, but in a much more kind of nationalistic social conservative direction. Czech Social Democrats, or what's left of them, who are now aligned with the communists, doing likewise. So they kind of bet on the kind of politics that Fico and Smer pioneered. But there are people who are still more radical. There's this little body called the Svatopluk Association, which is associated with Petr Drulák. He was a Social Democratic deputy minister, advisor to the then foreign minister Zaorálek. And he and the people around him are very seriously working on a kind of left-right mashup, which is illiberal, which is national, which is nationalist, and which is more kind of thought through and has more of a political vision. And I think we need to watch in the long term whether these type of ideas start to find their way into the sort of bloodstream of organized Czech politics. Because, left and right radical left and right have a lot in common, and they know it. It's only the motorists, for example, who are talking an anti-communist rhetoric. So I think there is a potential for, I suppose you could call it, a kind of national populist party, which is neither left nor right. And that's what we need to watch. Babiš, though, in some ways, as populist government, he's been called a technocratic populist. He's sort of the lesser evil in the sense that he's totally uninterested in ideology beyond a certain set of managerial principles, despite the political cross-dressing and the links with Orban. The dangers with Babiš are, I think, his predilection for centralizing power, rather than him having any kind of inclination to do a kind of Viktor Orban-style remaking of politics. I also think, he's not like a wrecking ball like Trump. I don't think he has a sort of this radical desire to knock institutions over. His business model and his origins is more about gradual takeover and deals which seem to benefit both sides, but actually benefit him. I think that is his model of politics. I think, again, look back at Agora, how he runs it, how he built it. That is his model for how he would change the Czech state. So that's my sort of take on that. I think it's interesting what will happen down the line. At the moment, Czech politics is, as it has been for about the past 10 years, it's Babiš. It's all Babiš. It's all Anna.
Could someone other than Babiš form a government after elections? For example, Anna's deputy chairman, Karel Havlíček, since President Petr Pavel might try to prevent Babiš from becoming prime minister.
I doubt that. Obviously, the Czech constitution allows the president to nominate literally anyone as prime minister. It doesn't even have to be a deputy. And Miloš Zeman did show how you could do that in 2013. But I think politically, it would be impossible for Pavel to do. He wouldn't be dealing with a kind of failing, scandal-hit government, but with a prime minister with a new popular mandate. So I think Petr Pavel, if he's going to use his presidential powers, he will be much more concerned with the shape of the government and who the ministers are, rather than trying a very confrontational move like blocking Babiš. I think he will use, or rather misuse, his powers of ministerial appointment to block any minister. He shouldn't do it, but Czech presidents can and do, to block any ministers he doesn't like.
Do you see any chance that the current government could remain in power after the election?
Do they have a path to victory? I guess that you'd need to look for two things. You'd need to look for, first of all, you'd need to look for small parties not making it into parliament. So you'd have to watch enough, Stachilo. They would have to slip below 5%. Babiš would have won in 2021 if even one of these smaller parties that didn't make it into parliament had done so. He'd been able to form a coalition. Plus, we would need some kind of last-minute, under-the-radar growth in support for all three of the parties of the former Fiala coalitions. We would need Together's anti-Babiš, pro-democracy messaging to cut through or to be more effective than we think it is. We need the Pirates to do well. Now, they are doing quite well and are kind of creeping up in the polls, and they've recovered from the kind of disasters they had before. So we'd need them to kind of do better than expected. And we would need, I think, the mayors to also do much better than expected. And I doubt all four of these things will happen. There's no real sign of these things happening. And if you look at public opinion, it's strongly kind of against Fiala. So it's kind of like a rearguard action. So there's a very, very narrow path to victory there. The other thing that might upset the upper cart is, of course, if Anna underperformed and radical parties did much better, and how Babiš would manage that. I do see potential in the longer term for cooperation on some things at some level between Anna and the parts of ODS or ODS, if Fiala leaves and the party sort of reinvents itself a bit, or the mayors. Certain things like standing up for national interests in the EU, rejecting the Green Deal, that's perfectly acceptable to the Civic Democrats. Plus, of course, Anna, we haven't talked about this, has made all of these promises of public spending and tax cuts and so on. And it's very, very hard to see how they will deliver any of this stuff. And it's all, we'll find savings on, very unconvincing explanations about we'll make savings in public administration and so on. And it's perfectly conceivable that Anna is going to find itself, Babiš government, Prime Minister Babiš, is going to find himself in a very similar position to Fiala in 2 or 3 years, with very frustrated and discontented voters, particularly more radically minded voters. who bought into his rhetoric without quite seeing what he was really promising. And Babiš may need or want support from the former opposition. I think we shouldn't forget that. There's a narrative that Central European, Slovak, Czech politics, there's all this big struggle between populists on one side and liberals on the other side. And in the Czech case, it's kind of not quite true. And that's always been a pattern in Czech politics: superficial polarization, ideology, but undercut by a kind of very brutal pragmatism. And we kind of saw that with Klaus and Zeman and the opposition agreement. And we may see a similar pattern repeated. But I can't see a sort of repetition of 2021.
And finally, Sean, and returning to Czech-Slovak relations, it seems certain that Babiš would revive government meetings with Bratislava, which Prime Minister Petr Fiala put on hold. So what would it mean, all of this? What would ANO-led government mean also for the Visegrad 4?
Well, ANO has obviously committed that it said it wants to work with Hungary and Slovakia, and Visegrad is the obvious vehicle to do that. I think that what will the new, as we assume it will be Babiš-led government would do, would be to sort of cooperate on certain issues where it sees Czech national, so the Green Deal, Migration Pact, policy on Ukraine to some extent, falling in and coordinating with Hungary and Slovakia, but being much less high profile. So using them as political cover. We'll see obviously contacts and warm relations, Babiš is of Slovak origin apart from everything else, but between the Fico government and future Babiš government. What I don't think we would see, though, is photos of Andrej Babiš in the Kremlin with Vladimir Putin. I think that the Babiš future government would essentially use, that really is the word, would use its relationship with Slovakia and Hungary, use them as kind of political cover, and will not be an awkward partner in the European context like Orban is, but would simply use its position as a bargaining chip to get what it wanted on other issues. Again, I think it is a transactional move. We would superficially see a more illiberal Visegrad 3, but with Babiš, I think it is brutally transactional, and it's about, he's not very interested in foreign policy apart from anything else, but it's about power and control and interests and resources with very few really logical principles. We can say, genuinely he wants Czech sovereignty, pretty genuinely Eurosceptic, genuinely doesn't, like green politics and so on, but not in a deeply ideological, he's going to make, Slovakia and Hungary can do the heavy lifting, I think is the answer, and the Czechs will just reap the benefits. It's sort of a typical kind of Babiš deal where it's superficially equal, but he reaps the benefits.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe, listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on the other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. For the link, see also a description of this episode. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.